Cave-in. This document, maintained by the Jones Law Office, is, by the request of Mr. Barney Sheehan, reserved for the eyes of Jim Sheehan, Jr. Dear Jim, it is, as I write this, the autumn of 1991. When you read this letter, I'll have already passed. Given my age, I feel the time is near, and this was the best method I could think of to impart what needs to be imparted, to plumb my soul's darkest reaches before the end. I left it with the family lawyer in Beattyville under promises you, my eldest and most level-headed grandson, would be the first to read it. I trust you are the first to read it, and I would urge you up front not to do so in the company of the family. Keep them at arm's length, and only come back to the text when you are certain you'll be able to finish it undisturbed. It's long, I know, but the content demands the length, and I don't want others dragged into what I have left to reveal. There are things even a son shouldn't know about his father, and things a grandson shouldn't know about his grandfather. There are things no man should know, regardless of his blood or the strength of his mind. I've endeavored to protect you and your brothers from this all my life, and I would have taken this tale to my grave where it belongs, were it not for the four of you toying with reopening the old cave-turned-mine you stumbled on hunting the feral plot a few years back. Even if your father or one of his brothers were still with us, I never dared tell any of them what I'm now setting out to tell you. Awful as it is, I never wished to burden another mind with it. Now I feel my hand has been forced, and I pray you'll listen to all I'm about to tell you, and the warnings which will follow. I'm just a year shy of 100, the oldest man in Lee County, according to Dr. Millen. Probably one of the oldest in Kentucky, if I had to guess. The influenza last year reminded me how tentative my life is. I could go any day, and I expect I won't last many more winters in these hills. Blessed as I am to have the memory and mobility I have at my age, and you boys to stock wood for the fire up at the house, the cold weighs heavier on me every time it sets back in. I feel in my bones that the next winter will be my last. That's fine by me, as I'm more than prepared to go. Better now than the day I begin to forget my name and the faces around me, as I've told the four of you several times. But, as I said, I have things to impart before I go. I'm the last man alive who remembers them. The people around Beattyville worked hard to bury what needed to be buried up there around that old mine, and while I can't summon the courage to tell you in person, I know I have some time before you boys garner the funds to really look into that mine along Farrell's Ridge. The people of these mountains are wary of outside influence, and with good reason. The land speculators who snapped it all up in the 1700s to sell it to the impoverished early settlers were all coastal plantation men, and they had little regard for the lawless mountaineers who spilled their own blood to settle it. Any mining operations launched here have been profitable, but never for the men doing the mining. The funds and material always seemed to trickle upstream to their shareholders and owners in Pennsylvania or New York, where the urban elite counted their coin and sneered at the illiterates down south in the hollers toiling away in company towns. I'm sure you remember that your brother baited me down from the mountains to Lexington nearly a decade ago now to see a comedy routine in a theater. The northeastern clown on the microphone opined that beyond the lights of the city, cavemen were still clubbing raccoons and eating raw meat in the hills. He said some places were so backward that he sometimes wished they could be hit with a can of human raid so that civilization might start over there. Veiled in comedy, that's exactly the murderous view most take of us. An embarrassment, remnants of an older, less enlightened age which have only accidentally clung to life as long as we have. In a way, they are more right than they know. This is an old, old land, and the people which live in it have been largely shielded by poverty and isolation from the cultural rot and decadence that swept the rest of the nation. Most of us would spray Boston or Philadelphia or New York with that metaphorical can of Raid as readily as he'd spray West Virginia or the Blue Ridge. It's very much a two-way street. Appalachia's memory is long and vivid. It remembers how life was lived when there were no city lights and no organized local governments. It remembers how to keep its people safe from outside meddling. It remembers how to keep traditions alive, and, when the time is right, to stamp them out. Appalachia recalls how to keep secrets. All this you know, of course. You've lived half a century here just as I've lived a whole century here. This place courses through your veins just as readily as it does through mine. I merely say all this to make clear to you why this is the first time you'll hear about what I am about to tell you. If you have any sense, you will also be the last to know. Many men who knew it carried it gladly to their graves. If I weren't sure you'd doom yourself sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, I'd do the same. With that preamble spent, I'd like you to imagine Lee County as it was when I was a boy, and beyond. No electric, no plumbing, no paved or gravel roads. The only true highway was the Kentucky River, and it was rare indeed we saw an outsider. Your great-grandfather kept hogs. We grew only enough crops to keep ourselves full and the still running. You and the other kids played around the old cabin's foundation when you were boys, out behind my place, overlooking the family plot where you've hopefully already laid me to rest. Labor was hard, but limited to a few hours a day for most of the year. We had plenty of time to wander and get to know each other. Just about everything you ate, drank, and used was grown or built local, and, even more so than today, everyone knew everyone. No one ate a bad dinner or killed a big buck in Lee County without every soul in the hills hearing about it. So, it should come as no surprise that florid, fantastic legendary was a core part of the cultural tapestry around Beattyville, just as it is today, to a lesser extent. The stories of fey woodland folk and strange noises in the hills were as ancient as the land the settlers lived on, and most of those stories were dragged over on ships from the old world. Some they got from the Indians of the hill country who they'd warred with in the early years. A few were entirely new, born of the union of the Celtic and Germanic mind with the soil of a beautiful, vast, alien land. Whatever the genesis of the legends, they all agreed there were things in the woodland hills that no man could truly understand, and places in the darkest hollers where it was best not to settle. One of those places was a cave, a foul crack in the earth at the bottom of a dark valley in the eastern reaches of the county. The very first European squatters to come into Lee County as permanent residents recorded that the savages would not hunt or camp in the valley, and called it by a Shawnee phrase that roughly translated to Vale of No Return. The forest grew quiet around that valley, and the trees were wont to die young in peculiar sandy soil which seemed almost ashen. Only the cruelest of briars and the most gnarled pines seemed to thrive there, and the skeletal outline of the dying growth was as much a deterrent to the prospective settler as the fearsome reputation. As more and more plots were divvied up, and more settlers poured into the region, that valley was never developed. Its deep forest was never cleared for swine or goats, and its dying trees were never harvested to be burned as potash, as was common on poor farming ground in those days. By the time Beattyville was established around 1850, it was just called Beatty at that time. Few in the hills remembered the Indian legendary or their tales of vanished hunting parties and strange sightings in the depths of the wilted wood. All they knew was that the eastern valley was no good, and it didn't do to wander there. A fair number of strange things happened up there over the long march of years Appalachia spent holding out against the industrial age which was setting in on the lowlands. The mountains around that blasted valley swallowed a party of hunters in 1860, and no amount of searching ever turned up traces of the 7 men and their dogs. Lights were observed flickering on the ridge-tops along the valley's edge, bonfires perhaps, around Hallowmas of 1866, but come morning, no sign of revelry or ritual in the wilting woodland could be found. After a string of horses bolted for no discernible reason along a dirt path into town which wound alongside the dying span of forest, injuring several who were tossed from their saddles in the confusion, a reverend in town started to call the place the Pit, and that name was the one which stuck in the minds of the people of Lee County. Me and my kinfolk were raised on stories about the Pit. One of my father's favorites was about a massive black bear a few men from south of the river chased into the eastern hills in '77. It had been killing sheep and dogs along the edge of town, and when a party finally set out to kill it, they drove it by some malignant misfortune into the dead woods around the Pit. When the pack of hunting dogs, baying and frothing, refused to cross over the ridge into the blasted forest, the hunters themselves chased alone. They hemmed the bear in on the valley floor and drove it to the mouth of the caves there. To a man, the hunters thought it would flee into the dark to escape them, but it didn't. When it saw it was cornered, it took a long look into the blackness at its back, and then settled down in the dirt and waited to be killed. Another concerned a group of foreign miners, whether Portuguese or Spanish my father never could decide, who tried to prospect the Pit with aims of developing it into a mine around 1880. Coal was just beginning to be dug around here by northern firms, but most of the locals hadn't fallen into mine work yet, and even the men on the ground from mining companies in distant Philadelphia or New York City knew better than to poke around in the dead valley. There were easier pits deeper in the mountains, with less unsettling lore around them. The foreigners didn't know better, and they didn't much care to heed the warnings of the locals. When they found a big vein a few hundred yards into the natural tunnels, they brought equipment, built homes, and began a wholehearted mining operation. None were surprised when, a few weeks later, they packed up and left empty-handed, abandoning their equipment in hastily built shacks to rot around the Pit. There were 3 missing, but the foreigners didn't linger to look for them. One who stopped to supply in town was drunk and jittery, and rambled to a shopkeep about whispers and footsteps and knocks in the cave, about whistling and strange words that rose up from the Pit when there wasn't anyone inside. He said the cave system went far, far deeper than they'd imagined, and that he wouldn't be surprised if the system honeycombed the whole county. When he started to talk about eyes which reflected lamplight in the dark and long, tapering fingers which snuffed out candles in the gloom, his countrymen pulled him out and started on their way. Most curious of all the tales were the footprints. Even after I was born in the early 90s, it was rare that a winter passed without them being spotted winding through the snowdrifts on hills which bordered the valley, and every family in town seemed to have a story about them. I palled around with old Tim Kearney and Bert Farrell, and we used to wander the very same feral plot you and your brothers hunt on now, as I've told you many times. What I've avoided telling you is that when we'd sled those woods in the dead of January, there were fresh, bare footprints in the snow up there each morning, like a man's, only much longer, with toes too splayed and thin to be natural. There were dozens of sets of them some years, when nights were particularly dark. The prints would bound and leap and creep, taking long strides we'd trace through the powder. We were never bold enough to poke down into the valley and check, but every one of us knew without seeing that whatever made them was coming up out of the pit and circling back before dawn. Well, the town did well enough leaving the place alone, and only fools from outside ever fell foul of the place. Even children, brash as they can be, seemed overcome by the yawning quiet of the awful place, and let it be when they had cause to pass by the valley. Things went on like that until 1890, when another group of foreigners moved in, this time several large families with women and children in tow, and purchased around 500 acres in the eastern county in order to establish a community up there. The tract was perfectly centered by the blasted valley and the pit it sheltered. They bought the plot from the Farrells, and couldn't be persuaded that the place was dangerous. They were experienced miners, so they claimed, for they had worked the mines in their homeland, and were well aware of the dangers posed by the bowels of the earth. They had come, so those of them who bothered to speak said, from some remote hill village in Powys, Wales. Most spoke only broken English, with a language we all assumed was Welsh being by far their preferred tongue amongst themselves. You would think the shared Celtic blood and the fact that rural Wales, like Scotland, shares a certain cultural and topographical similarity to Appalachia, might help the outsiders better integrate with the mountaineers who surrounded them, but this was certainly not the case. They learned no English, schooled their children at home, and joined no local churches. The pastors in town speculated this was because the foreigners were some variety of papist, which only further alienated them from the fiercely Protestant locals. Perhaps the strangest of all these habits was the total lack of trade they did with the town itself. Any food, tools, and supplies the Welsh around the pit needed they either grew and crafted themselves, or bought and imported from elsewhere in the country. More so than ever, the blasted upland vale where the cave brooded amidst the village of furtive newcomers seemed a different land than the tracts that surrounded it, and the reputation it held only darkened over time. They named their modest hamlet Far Brecon, though they tended to say the Far in Welsh on the few occasions people in Beattyville had cause to hear them speak it. They seemed content to keep to themselves, and strange as they were, the people of Lee County were keen on doing just that. The insular nature of the 60 or 70 Welsh up there was only part of the problem. They looked strange. So strange, in fact, that the town's physician thought they were ill when they first came into Beattyville with a mind to purchase land. They were a good 6 or 7 inches taller than most locals, with even the women usually standing a little over 6 feet tall. But it was a lean, emaciated height, which brought to mind old images of starving long hunters in Civil War prison trains. Their limbs hung loose and limber, and seemed far too long to be normal. And yet, given the refusal of all local horses to tolerate the presence of the newcomers, they took to hauling their goods uphill into Far Brecon on wagons they pulled by hand. A lone man from Far Brecon once tugged a cart of mining supplies which must have weighed the better part of half a ton up the rough dirt path out of town. Thus, the uncanny slenderness didn't speak to frailty or weakness. If anything, they seemed quicker and stronger than most of their neighbors. Their fingers were skeletal and as unbelievably long as the legs, with tips that seemed just slightly bulbous, like those of a frog who clings to walls. They seemed always to be slick with sweat, and those who had met them ceased to offer them handshakes when rare encounters on the road brought locals face to face with the lanky newcomers. It was noticed among watchful Kentuckians of that region that Brecon's hunting parties built no tree stands and used no ladders when taking game from the forests of the county. The foreigners clambered the slick trunks of pines as easily as the gnarled trunks of oaks, and perched like apes in the tree boughs to watch for prey down the barrels of their rifles. Their skin was so pale that in certain lights it was almost translucent, and even the youngest of them boasted dark veins which seemed ebon against their sickly pallor. A good 6 years after I was born in '92, my older sister came home screaming one unseasonably warm autumn afternoon that she'd spotted one of the foreigners hauling firewood uphill out of a glen alongside the county road. The man had been shirtless to combat the heat of the day and his labor, and as he crested a ridge to be backlit by the setting sun, my sister swore she could see the man's entire skeleton and organ structure, ribs, gizzards, and all, silhouetted within his ghostly flesh like meat suspended in jelly. Their noses were remarkably small and upturned, and their hair was uniformly an almost ashen, spider-silk blonde, which seemed to fade to gray before 30. The men kept their heads nearly shaven, and the women seemed always to sport bonnets, scarves, or hoods which masked their coifs of painfully bright hair. They only ever went with heads and arms uncovered around dawn or dusk, when the thick woods of the looming hills could shield their delicate skin from the harsh rays of the sun. The most off-putting were the eyes. They were large, not so large that they seemed out of the realm of possibility, but just large enough that the skulls of the people from far Brecon seemed to bulge outward slightly to accommodate the orbs when one looked closely enough. The color was always a rich, almost orange amber, and given the remarkable size of the pupils, the whites of those eyes were almost invisible. Dark as they were, they seemed onyx against the ivory of the newcomer's skin. On the rare occasion visitors to the county passed some of the foreigners on the back roads at night, they always came into Beattyville proper declaring that those unsettling, staring eyes reflected lamplight in the dark, like the eyes of a cat or hunting coyote. Everyone expected the weird Welsh settlers would be driven off eventually, but that day never came. If anything, the people of Far Brecon seemed to be warming up to their new environment. They burned great bonfires beneath the lightless shadow of new moon nights, and sang so wildly in their strange tongue that the words often echoed down to the ears of shaken townsfolk as they lay awake in bed. Their wooden flutes often wailed into the wind almost till morning. Some intrepid hunters who dared to climb a mighty old chestnut growing on a neighboring ridge for a clear view of the foreigner's hamlet during one such lunatic festival said they were all naked, and that their awkward, capering, long-limbed jigs took them in and out of the mouth of the pit which centered the settlement. Things only grew stranger in 1896, when the fruits of the hitherto shrouded mining operations of those odd-looking Welshmen were revealed. They'd been digging up precious gems, it seemed, and they came that spring into Beattyville hauling several carts filled to the brim with glistening diamonds, rubies, and darkest emeralds. Many muttered that the geology wasn't right for such things here, but every 6 months or so the foreigners brought more crystalline treasure down out of the higher hills, and the Beattyville trader who sold them on to buyers in Lexington and Louisville stopped asking questions. He became a wealthy man, but the vast sums the village of Far Brecon was making never seemed to be reinvested in the shabby huts of the upland settlement, nor did it get spent on luxurious clothing or food, or trips to other parts of the country. Rather, it was often spent on vast herds of livestock, often 100 head of sheep or cows at a time, which the Welshmen bought from neighboring counties. It was oft remarked in the 1890s that the tall men from Far Brecon might buy 500 cattle in a year, and yet their tiny village pasture in the wilted woodland meadow beside the pit never boasted more than 20. Well, things progressed like that for some time. When little Alfred Keel went missing from his family farm along the north side of the river in 1899, just a week prior to one of their raucous new moon bacchanals, the town launched a few inquiries up in Far Brecon to no avail. This spurred more hushed conversation than ever about the town, and threw out most all the goodwill the people of Beattyville might have maintained towards the furtive foreigners. When another child, Michaela Higgs, went missing after a long spate of dog disappearances around town in 1901, the Lee County Sheriff raised a posse of 50 armed men which he led straight to Far Brecon that night. Sheriff Hutch came back down the next morning with 10 fewer men. His face was far more pale than a sleepless night and a long hike into town would have warranted, and his voice trembled as if he were fighting pneumonia. The other members of the party weren't much better, and it took them a long time to open up. When at last they did, their story convinced the townsfolk that the outsiders weren't just strange, they were wicked. Hutch had interrupted a celebration or ritual of some sort, just like the one hunters had spied upon years earlier. They broke up the gathering and pulled aside the eldest of the men in Far Brecon. After they had dressed, the heads of the village told him in broken English that they knew nothing of the Higgs' disappearance, and that they did not appreciate the intrusion of the sheriff's department on their ceremony. When Sheriff Hutch produced a ream of warrants and demanded to search the huts, the Welshman demurred, but the huts in town proved empty, and the towering residents of Far Brecon followed the posse around like curious wolves, their eyes catching the light of the party's torches. It was then Hutch heard a wail from deep down in the pit, reverberating up from the stony maw of the place as if the earth itself had loosed the scream. It was high-pitched, shrill, the keening of a frightened child, he thought, colored by the desperation of a horrible environment. Incredibly, the intrepid Hutch and a dozen of his boys told the others to keep an eye on the foreigners, and pushed down into the pit with torches high and guns braced. A Far Brecon man was drafted to lead them, and that unnaturally lean giant wove his way through the crags and crevices ahead of them like a master. So fast was he that, by 30 minutes into the crawl, the posse's caving party could not locate him, and they had to progress on their own. Hutch couldn't really bring himself to say much about what the caverns had been like, or how long he'd been in them with his picked men. What was clear, though, was that the trek was long, and often necessitated crawling and scrabbling in the tightest spaces of the manse. Every once in a while, a head count would reveal one among their number was simply missing, and no amount of echoing yells down the tunnels would yield a response. Now and then a girlish cry would sound, drawing them deeper into the pit, and yet no girl ever answered their searching shouts. At last they came into a broad cavern with a soaring ceiling, whose floor swept down and away into the nighted depths of the earth beneath them. Amidst the shadows along the foot of the jagged, stalagmite-riven slope, barely visible in the flickering light the remaining men bore, 100 sets of eyes glinted back up at them, staring and waiting for the men to make a move. Hutch and his men retraced their steps and refrained from a panicked stampede. Even so, with a stealth none among the few who crawled free of the dark that night could comprehend, a full 5 more of the men were dragged silently into the deeps by tapering limbs they half glimpsed in the flashes of gunfire they loosed at the slinking shapes in the murk. When they finally broke into the pre-dawn light of the surface once more, with no rescued child to show for their efforts, it was just Sheriff Hutch and 2 teenagers from town who were left from the caving party. The posse who'd remained on the surface led the shaken survivors home when the residents of Far Brecon made empty promises to search the caverns for survivors in the days to come. Hutch couldn't bring himself to launch a massive militia action against the outsiders lurking up there in the hills, and he also couldn't send to the governor in hopes the National Guard might be sent to turn the place over and see what was going on up there. What would poor Hutch say? That there were demoniac ghouls in the hills that needed to be exterminated? No, that wouldn't do. With Hutch's evidence against the strangers being entirely driven by their odd behavior, and the unease it roused in the people of Beattyville and the county at large, he didn't have enough to take immediate actions. He was a small-time, backwoods lawman, and there would be no cavalry sent east from Frankfort to back him up. Shaken as he was, though, he wasn't helpless, and he deputized many in the community with military backgrounds or hunting experience to patrol the county roads at night. They roamed with great packs of bloodhounds, who would occasionally start and bay bloody murder at the sky in the quiet woods on darkened nights. Men sat up late and took shifts with their sons minding the porches till dawn banished the threat of things which might creep in the shadows. Parents stopped allowing their children free rein of the woodland, and were especially adamant that the youngsters of the town, myself among them, didn't stray anywhere near the dead vale and the unwholesome village of moon-eyed strangers within it. The only exception to that rule was my eldest brother, Eamon. He was lost to us long before your time, but he was a tall, lean, imaginative sort, not like the rest of the family. A bit like your father, really. God rest both their souls. Eamon was impractical and prone to long, lonely rambles in the hills. He'd scribble poetry when the rest of us kids were hunting squirrel or hare. He clashed with my father quite a bit in those days, and through listening in on those back porch arguments past sundown, I learned Eamon had bumped into a girl from Far Brecon foraging mushrooms on the county road sometime in the spring of 1903. He'd stricken up a friendship with her, which my father rightly took to mean courtship. Eamon would stroll the hollers south of the road, and she'd meet him there, and they would talk till dusk demanded she slip off back to Far Brecon. Our father, needless to say, was not happy about the situation, but Eamon talked him into staying silent on it. Difficult as the thought of Eamon getting attached to one of the foreigners from Far Brecon was, it was agreed that the girl's parents would likely be even more hostile, for the strangers had never tried to hide their icy disdain for the people of the wider county. No one knew what foul things they might do if they got wind of the teenage romance, so our father was hemmed into a reluctant silence for the sake of the both of them. Between 1903 and 1905, on summer nights when our parents were dancing in town, Eamon would sometimes sit in the yard scored by cicada song and speak with the rest of us about her. She was called Fionn, and as he supplemented the limited English she'd picked up from old books in her youth, she told Eamon much about happenings in Far Brecon. They were some sort of pagans, he said, and they had indeed been miners back in their native Wales. Their practices, about which Fionn seemed reluctant to tell, had been uncovered by a neighboring town there, and the whole of their community had apparently decided it was better to flee to the New World than to be forced into reform at home. A group she called the Below Folk, with which her people had shared communion back home, had supposedly hinted there were subterranean colonies of their race up and down the Appalachian Mountains, and had helped guide them to the Wilted Valley and the hated pit it hid. They called this pit the Ogof, a word I've since learned simply means cave. They made offerings of animals to the things they said lived within, a detail that made all of us uneasy given the circumstances of the disappearances which had troubled the region. But Fionn said the Below Folk here were not quite like the ones which had dwelt beneath Wales. They were strange, she claimed, and worshipped a slumbering god apart from the old Fey pantheon the ones back home had followed. They were harsher and far more demanding of their subjects on the surface. Though they brought Far Brecon the glittering treasure it sold to the outside world from deep within the earth, they also requested far more frequent offerings than those in the old world had done. We, of course, already unnerved by the outsiders, demanded that Eamon press her for more details of the things beneath the ground and the offerings they demanded. Partially, this was out of concern for Beattyville and the surrounding communities. I'll freely admit it was just as much to do with the fact that we were cunning youngsters fiercely curious about the goings-on up in the Forbidden Vale. Whatever our motives, we badgered Eamon enough that he began subtly badgering Fionn for details, and what she eventually told him was so terrible and unbelievable that, even compared to the other fantastic details he'd pulled from the talkative girl, it shook us to our young and timid cores. Fionn wouldn't tell everything, but she told enough. She said that the Below Folk had been known to her kindred for nearly 1,000 years in the old country. Only relatively recently had they begun to trade with their cousins on the surface. It was sometime in the 16th century that one of the Below Folk had offered gems and precious minerals to the surface folk, for a price they termed the mingling. From what Fionn understood, every woman among the surface folk was taken into the earth on the cusp of her 16th year, and paired with one of the folk from below in a ritual meant to produce hybrid offspring. She was then returned to the settlement beneath the sun, married among her own kin, and raised whatever child resulted as her own. It was through this mingling ritual that Fionn speculated her people had become so tall, and garnered their characteristic strength, speed, and nocturnal eyesight, but she could not know for sure. The women of Far Brecon, her mother among them, never spoke of the mingling in open terms. They revered the process, but they knew the half-glimpsed things in the dark below unnerved their children on an instinctive level, and they held back the intimate details until the day had come, and the rite was to be undertaken. Fionn's elder sisters had all been through the mingling, but refused to speak of it, even to their dear sister. With her own 16th birthday approaching that winter, the girl grew more and more frightened of what awaited her. I think that's the only reason she dared spill the secrets of Far Brecon to Aemon. She'd grown attached to him, certainly, but he was also the only person outside of the ring of the surface folk in whom she could confide. She wanted Aemon to take her away, she said, and he was scrambling to come up with the funds and the courage to try. Aemon had us pitch in money we made doing fence repairs and selling small game pelts in town to help him stock up food, and the cash for train tickets south out of the state. He spent the autumn practicing with a dependable old revolver our grandfather had given him for his 10th birthday, interested, for the first time in his life, in learning how the weapon was used. He spent long hours away, telling our father he was working jobs in neighboring counties to explain the money we'd passed him, and we stayed silent. Young and naive as we were, we could still recognize that this was a crossroads Aemon meant to walk in his own way, and meant to help him do it. The night came at last on the 9th of December in 1905, a week before Fionn's Day of Reckoning, a date I'll never see the fortune to forget. An early snow had dusted the hills, and the shining moon was waxing in a cloudless sky. This made even the deepest depths of Appalachia's winter woodland navigable in the sheen of the frozen fugue. The surface folk up in Far Brecon would be loath to walk or skulk beneath the light of so bright a moon. I'll never know exactly why it was Aemon chose me to be his lookout. Perhaps it was because I was the best shot with a rifle. Perhaps it was because I spent the most time following him around, and he knew I looked up to him enough to keep his secret, at least as long as it took for him to slip down. Perhaps it's just because I was home that night, and I was the first he ran into in his frenzied search for help. Whichever it was, when he stumbled in with battered suitcase and glinting revolver in hand to beg for me to watch his back while he went to meet with Fionn for their final escape, I didn't hesitate to agree. We ran up sodden roads and over crushing snowbanks to cut quickly through toward Far Brecon across the county, the mountains snapping up the final rays of the cold sun as we went. The pair were to meet in the shadow of a lightning-blackened tree in a deep enshrouding stand of pines along the county road, one of the sole places cloaked in shadow amidst all that milky moonlight. Aemon posted me on a ridge perhaps 100 yards off, overlooking the road through the skeletal trees with my hunting rifle readied. He ordered me to shoot if it looked like the two of them were to be intercepted, but neither of us expected how totally the plan would fail. Neither of us could have known how many there would be. Fionn came into view amidst the barren trees alongside the road not long after Aemon got into position in the pines. It was the first and only time I'd see her, bundled against the chill and the damp, but clearly lithe and nearly as tall as Aemon. She had almost translucent hair that seemed to glisten blue in the gibbous brightness of the brisk night, and her huge eyes seemed to flash gold now and again, even at my distance. They embraced, half visible through the pine needles, scrabbling to make certain they had everything they needed before they began their sprint. I was slow to notice she did not come alone. The occasional glint of distant lights and the drip of melting ice made the nocturnal forest an eerie thing of glitter. It was only when a set of gleaming orbs appeared not 10 yards from Eamon and Fionn that I realized she'd been followed. I almost shot then, my finger twitching above the readied trigger. Thank God I refrained. Who knows what might have befallen me in the town at large had I foolishly revealed myself on the hill. More eyes appeared almost as quickly as the first. Dozens of pairs there were, then over 100, skittering as silhouettes across the snowy mountainside beyond the county road like ants surrounding a meal. I had nowhere near enough ammunition to make a dent in them. Eamon did not share my realization of the gravity of the situation, for he discharged all 6 shots he had available to him in the revolver when the searchers closed in upon them. Some fell, but most decidedly didn't, and they battered and tugged Eamon to the ground to be hauled off with his screaming lover. It was only then, when I heard her wail for him amidst bursts of frightened Welsh jabbering alien to my ears, that I realized it had not been a planned ambush, at least not on her part. Perhaps the surface folk had noticed clothing or provender missing from Fionn's house. Perhaps she'd confided in siblings or kin, just as Eamon had done, and they had proved less understanding than we had. Whatever had happened, she was as much the target of their hunt as he had been. I made a mad dash for home as soon as the foreigners had skulked far enough back towards Far Brecon that I figured my footfalls in the snow wouldn't draw attention. I made record time, and yet as I rattled off my story to my father, and he sprinted off with me and my brothers in tow to Beattyville to rouse the sheriff, I was convinced we'd be too late. My imagination spun whole tapestries of the torments they'd be passing over Eamon up there, and my hands were numb against my rifle with a chill that had nothing to do with the nip of the winter air. Looking back on it, I'm amazed the town reacted as quickly as it did. I suppose Sheriff Hutch had more than enough reason to trust my account, and the shaken men from that first posse which had barged into Far Brecon years back had passed their fears on to their families and friends in the lower valleys. By 10 that night, there was a mob of 500 armed men, nearly all in the county within running distance of Beattyville, with torches and lanterns bared above the glinting barrels of shotguns and rifles, and the flashing heads of axes and hammers. We went up the county road towards Far Brecon in a great jumble, hunting dogs weaving between our legs and nervous conversation on our lips. There was chanting in the dead valley before us, and we could see from the smoke and the red upon the backdrop of the neighboring ridges that fires were being burned amidst that cavalcade of foreign words. Father took me aside then, told me to stay back and keep clear of what was about to happen. Some other disappointed teenagers in the ranks got the same treatment, being convinced it was to guard the rear by the veterans among the party. Some of the better handlers among them took the dogs, who still refused to enter the environs of Far Brecon, out in an arc along the ridge, aiming to hem in the village. Then the men pushed up over the hills and down the rough road into the heart of Far Brecon. We boys who'd been left behind waited with bated breath, of course. The otherworldly chanting, which had seemed so infinite as it echoed up the hills and into the night sky, faltered. There were calls, shouts, a scream as of a woman taken by surprise. A brisk, manic argument ensued, Sheriff Hutch being one of the parties involved, though I could discern the words of neither he nor his enemy. A single shot rang out, somewhere in the east of the Wilted Valley. An absolute silence followed, and for what seemed like a minute the whole forest seemed to hold its breath along with us. Then the gunfire started in earnest. It wasn't much like a war. Though I seldom talked about it with you boys, I went to France in 1917, and for all the shellfire and machine gun discharge, the shootout in Far Brecon was so much more awful. so much more personal. Men, our fathers and brothers and teachers, howled as if they'd seen demons as the fighting started. The women of Far Brecon shrieked and called orders to startled children in Welsh. The dogs overlooking the slaughter bayed, anxious for their masters but still unwilling to risk the holler. It wasn't long before the pained shouts and frantic screams of injury rang out into the barren trees, seeming to taunt and gnaw at our ears as we shivered in the awful night air. It was young Noel Nagel that risked the ridge first from among our number. He had 4 brothers in the mob, and wanted to help if they were in trouble. That was all it took to send the rest of us scuttling up after him to look down into the tumult, and what we saw down there ensured not one of us ever slept soundly in the hill country we loved again. The people of Far Brecon had constructed an altar of stacked limestone slabs just outside the mouth of the pit. It was around this they'd been gathered, and there they made their stand. A few of the strange men had held guns of their own, but these had been the first to be shot, and lay bleeding into the churned snow. Many of their fellows had scuttled like spiders up the walls of the leaning huts and shacks which constituted the town, and were braining the mob with stones and tools. Their moon-eyed women and children wailed and tried to make for the mouth of the cave, but some were inevitably hit by stray rounds. But there were other shapes in the vale as well, even taller and more uncanny than the foreigners. Nude and agile, I immediately knew these twisted, living geists were the below folk. They were larger, paler, stranger mirrors of their tributaries from the surface, and their movements were even faster, even more impossible to trace as my eyes bounced from trunk to battered foundation in a vain attempt to track them all. A dozen or so of these malformed giants leapt and bounded around the village, and they had already taken what looked to be cruel stone hatchets to a full 24 of our men. I saw Nagel's father's skull hoven in the first few seconds I had eyes on the clearing as one of the below folk leapt down upon him, only to dart away at the sound of shotgun fire nearby. They were not invincible, for I already saw 2 thrashing and bleeding in the shadows beneath the altar, but their motions were so twitchy, so unpredictable, that it was hard to draw a clear shot at them. I saw Sheriff Hutch die in the jaws of something huge, black and skittering that rose up from the well just outside town to drag him in with it as it withdrew. It was so fast I doubted my eyes as it happened, and yet Hutch was never found after all was said and done. It seemed almost to be a centipede, but surely such a thing is a biological impossibility. Surely they can't grow to be 10 or 20 feet long. Parson Byrne managed to kill one of the giants with a lucky blow from a hatchet just before the arms of a second scooped him up and snapped his spine. A lone Far Brecon man who'd avoided the volleys and injured my father and several others with thrown stone from the roofs in town was yanked from the building and bludgeoned to death with emptied rifles. Liam Griffith, a boy who'd palled with Eamon for years, was stabbed by a Far Brecon woman when he made a dash for the mouth of the pit, perhaps trying to recover someone who'd been dragged into the dark. The woman likely thought he was going for the children and scattered survivors flocking into the shadows below. Whatever she believed, Liam's father shot her dead a moment after his boy fell, and he wept over him in the middle of all that chaos like a boulder weathering a storm. At the very center of it all, thrashing bound and naked on that godless altar, was Eamon. He was bleeding from 100 gashes and battered beyond all recognition, but I knew from the healthy color of his skin that he was who he was, even at that distance. I sprinted the 100 yards downhill into the fray and went to him, thinking to free him. By then, all the Far Brecon surface folk were either dead or lost in the darkness of the pit, and the subterranean giants were being finished off by injured and furious men. I reached his side, wiped the blood from his eyes, and went to cut him free, but he wouldn't follow me when I tried to pull him out of the valley to safety in the cold silence of the woods. Fionn had been taken into the caves by the giants, he said. He had to go after her. I refused to let him go. Weak as he was, I forcibly dragged him back up out of the valley, helped by my dazed and battered father after he realized what I aimed to do. We had to put him back in binds, for he wouldn't be dissuaded from his suicidal mission to dive headlong into the sunless hell which must exist far, far below our feet. Even as the last of the shots died away and the posse began to count its dead, he was still calling down into the valley like a madman. I was charged with hauling him home, so I didn't see what came next. The mayor and a judge from town took charge of the situation that night and set a rotating watch of 80 men on the clearing. The next morning, dynamite was brought in from Irvine, and a few of the miners among the group pushed forward a couple 100 yards into the pit, filled a pinch in the tunnel with explosives, and collapsed the Ogof for good. The huts and hovels were burned, and the twisted corpses, below folk and Welsh hybrids alike, were dumped down the well and covered over with heavy stone. Any fiscal or government records of Far Brecken's existence in Lee County were destroyed. The nearly 100 men from town who were slain or missing were said to have died in a gun battle with highwaymen in the hills. The land was silently passed back into the hands of the Farrell clan, as if none of this had ever happened. By the new year, there was no standing trace of Far Brecken, and Beattyville meant to keep it that way. I suppose one who didn't see what I saw that night would say the townspeople did it to protect themselves, and I suppose they'd be partly correct. After all, even with the dead giants and strange foreign corpses at hand, they would have little save hearsay to prove the Far Brecken miners had been murderous ritualists if a large-scale investigation was launched by the state government in Frankfurt. We were just a low-born gaggle of frightened rustics, after all, and the government in the bluegrass lowlands was just as likely to hang a few of us as gunfighters and rabble-rousers as launch an investigation into the caves. But simple self-preservation wasn't the reason. They did it because those things were not meant to be, leastways not up here beneath the light of the sun and the moon. Firmly as I believe in a scriptural hell, I also know there is a material, tangible hell, and it is anxious for traffic with the surface. Lee County crushed any chance that pit might have of ensnaring a wandering traveler or lost child ever again, and not one of us broke the silence save amongst ourselves, in quiet corners away from prying ears. That should tell you how I feel on the matter. It should tell you how all of us felt about it. Mining operations in neighboring counties would often complain that miners heard strange sounds, knocking through the stone and voices raised in chants caught through nigh invisible crevices in the coal-blackened rock. We in Beattyville would knowingly smile, and blame the tall tales on ancient superstitions handed down from those who'd come over in elder days from the old countries. As machines replaced pick-swinging men underground, talk of strange noises in the deeps waned, and we were happy to let memories of them fade into shrouded myth. Eamon recovered over the next few weeks, but he stayed silent. He left with a pack and rifle in the June of the next year. I've always believed he delved into the hills, mines, and caves of the region in a wild attempt to find Fionn. He never came back. I shouldn't have to tell you now that the cave on the Farrell plot you pulled that little diamond out of was the pit, the Ogof. That cave-in you're aiming to clear is the very same collapse we caused in the winter of 1905. It is the gate to a literal underworld, to fathomless gulfs that house scuttling things which hunt in shadows only they can truly call home. Do not open it. Kind and caring as you've been to me as I've aged, take that as an addition to my will. It is the most vital thing I've ever asked of you. Tell your brothers and whatever friends you've babbled about riches to whatever they'll believe is dismissal, but don't so much as look at that crag in the forest ever again. The birds sing there once more now that the way is closed, true, but there is no telling whether the long fingers of gangly things in the blackness still claw and scrabble at the threshold, waiting for a gap to be thrown wide. Do not give them the option. I fear, like so many of the ghastly monsters of old Europe, they will only be emboldened by the invitation. My dreams have been haunted by troglodyte wails and searching fingers and gleaming eyes since the earliest years of this century, and they grow worse this time of year, as the last of the leaves fall and the cold presses in to remind me what's coming. I can't pass the cool winters in my little house without imagining them behind every branch glimpsed through the windows at dusk. I can't walk the snows outside without being petrified at each step I'll spot those familiar, elongated, barefoot prints along the frigid hills. I can't sleep through a December night without awakening from nightmares about noseless, gigantic faces leering down on my bed from the doorway. The least you could do, for your aging grandfather and for this land which we both love, is to keep those eyes in the depths where they belong. Barney Sheehan, Beattyville, Kentucky, October 31st, 1991.